Hey everyone, so this will be our last little discussion here for um, Unit 2 with inflation as our third measure of economic performance. Um, yeah, so going to be a bunch of stuff here that I am borrowing from somebody else, obviously. So should be good stuff though, nonetheless. Let me get started here. So measuring the cost of living. There's gonna be two different terms that we use. There's gonna be inflation and the inflation rate. Usually, I'll use them interchangeably. Like whenever I talk about the inflation rate, chances are I'm just gonna use the word inflation. But anyways, what inflation is the overall price levels rising or the value of the dollar falling. And the inflation rate change, or sorry, the inflation rate is then going to be the percentage change from one time period to another, usually year by year, something like that. That's how we'll end up measuring it. Consumer price index then is going to be a way of looking at this and analyzing this and how much it's actually impacting people. So the consumer price index is a measure of the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical consumer. Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can look up all this online. They report it each month, and it's used to monitor the change of the cost of living over time. There are some big problems with this in recent years. For example, all of this is done using what's called a market basket, really great term to know, which is essentially all of the goods and stuff that a family would buy over a set period of time to measure this. Now, the problem is the Bureau of Labor Statistics is still using the same basket of goods that they were using 40 years ago. So yeah, the world's changed a lot over 40 years. Namely, we have internet, we have cell phones, all kinds of technology, stuff like that that are now mandatory, I guess you could say. Cable services too. Uh, there's really it's getting kind of dated at this point, and there's been a lot of calls to change it, but we'll see what ends up happening with that. Um, so when it rises, the typical family is spending more to maintain the same standard of living, right? Um, and with that, essentially, if they're spending more to get the same stuff, there's inflation. That's the idea behind it. So how it's calculated, again, there's this market basket. Um, so they send out monthly surveys to figure out prices for a certain set of goods and services that they've determined in this market basket. And again, it's going to be stuff that typical people buy. So, some examples that would be in it, it might be like a new shirt, a new toothbrush, maybe some hand soap, some oranges, throw some hot dogs in there and stuff like that. Um, so, something along those lines. Could be something else, though. Now, finding the prices will be the next part. Once they have all of those hot dogs and other goods in there, they need to figure out what the prices are at a certain point in time. So, for example, we would find out the prices in 2020 and also find out the prices probably in the year 2019, right? And then we can compare them. For all of the same amount of goods and services, the only thing that's changing, though, is the prices. And then we need to figure out the cost of everything that's in there, and that's when we start comparing them, right? So we tally everything up, we have our 50-cent oranges for 2019, our 51-cent oranges for 2020, and start comparing that to each other. So big part of this is choosing a base year as far as doing it on your own. Again, Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think they use 1980 as the base year, but for us, we can use whatever it is we end up choosing. So choose a base year and compute the index. And really all it is just as simple as pointing at one and saying, hey, you're the base year. Usually when you do it, it's just going to be the first year that's included because you'll compare 2, maybe 3 years, but nothing too terribly intense. So, and then you compute the index then, the CPI, by dividing the price of the basket in 1 year by the price of the base year and multiplying by 100, which is, trust me, it's a lot more simple than it sounds. So to compute the inflation rate then, it's the percentage change in the price index from the preceding period. So usually a price index then, it might be like 110, right? And then if it was 100 to 110, the percentage change then is 10%, right? Because 110 is 10% more than 100. So the inflation rate then is going to be calculated as follows. It'll be the CPI in year 2 minus the CPI in year 1 divided by the CPI in year 1 times 100, which again, it's far more, it's not as difficult as all of this makes it seem, and how much we'll be using it is pretty limited. So get an example of all this. So here's our fixed basket of goods. This is everything a family consumes in a month, not a munch. So in 1 month, our family of 4 is consuming 4 hot dogs and 2 hamburgers, right? So here's our example. So we have the price in all of the years, and again, when we're doing this, it'll be fairly simple stuff. There's really weird noises outside my room right now, and I don't know what they are. Hopefully they don't come in here. Anyways, so it'll just be simplified prices for the most part, and end up using simplified numbers more often than not as well. So for hot dogs, there's just 1, 2, then $3, and then hamburgers 2, 3, then $4. And then we start looking at the numbers, right? We have our 4 and 2, and we're comparing them. So in 2001, it's $8, then 14, then 20. So we're going to choose one as a base year. Again, it's going to be 2001. So our CPI for 2001 is going to be 100 because you're just dividing 8 by 8. And 2002, all right, it's going to be 175. And this is a really drastic change. Usually it's not this crazy. But it'll be $14 divided by $8 times 100, giving us 175. And then ultimately, 2003, it'll be $20 divided by 8 times 100, giving us 250. So what does all of this end up meaning then? So we'll use the CPI then to compute the inflation rate from the previous year. So going from 2001 to 2002, with our CPI going from 100 to 175, we get a 75% inflation rate from 2001 to 2002. Then we're going to compare 2002 to 2003, and the inflation rate's gone down, right? It's only 43%, because 250 minus 175 divided by 175 times 100 is 43%. So, no big deal. Now, how the Consumer Price Index is calculated, just more examples here. Looking at closer to reality type stuff. Base year is 2002. So in 2002, it costs $1,200, and in 2004, it's the same stuff. This is still those 4 hot dogs and 2 hamburgers. All right, it's going to be $1,236. What you do is you divide 1236 by 1200, multiply it by 100, and you get 103. And then, with it being 100, it's pretty easy to look at. Usually, like I said, the drastic changes from 100 to 250 is, I don't like it, and usually it'll just be small stuff anyway. So it's going to be 3%, right? Because if you're adding 3 to 100, right, 3% is, 3 is 3%, right? Because 3 out of 100 is 3%, so no big deal. So looking at what is actually in this then. And again, this is where one of the problems is with what's included. A lot of the stuff does remain true, like housing, food, and all that, transportation, as the biggest expenses. But the problem now is that communication, much larger than it ever has been before. Because again, with the market basket of goods, they weren't including stuff like cell phones, cell phone plans, internet, and stuff like that. So either that or other goods and services would be a lot higher if we're using one that's more responsive to today's world. There we go. So another part of the problem is it's also just measuring a typical cost or a typical person, right? Say that, for example, I don't like cheese, okay? Say there's a bunch of cheese thrown into this basket. That's not an accurate representation of me. If someone doesn't have a vehicle because they walk to work, well, it's not an accurate representation for them. So there's all kinds of problems with it as far as measuring it as far as cost of living goes, because we're just looking at the average. Some specific ones, substitution bias. It's one of the things we talked about before, is that substitutes, people buy them all the time because other stuff is too expensive. So, instead of buying a certain cheese that's listed in the market basket, they might buy a Kraft cheese instead. Introduction of new goods, right? Again, that's where those cell phones and internet come in. They're not counted in this. And then unmeasured quality changes, right? That's something that's kind of a big thing in today's world. It's something called shrinkflation, I guess you could say, where the price of goods has mostly remained the same for food, but it's only because you get less. And same thing with like shampoo and toothpaste and all that, right? And it's like 0.1 ounce at a time, so nobody really notices. But over a couple years, or over 15 years, or 40 years, makes a big deal. And they don't really end up getting measured because it's like 1 tube of toothpaste is what's being compared. But if they're half the size of 40 years ago, it's kind of a big deal. So this goes more into detail on these. Yeah, so it doesn't react to people reacting to changes in prices, what they do when they want to substitute goods or something like that. Introduction of new goods, again, internet and cell phones are the best example of this. The other side of it too is that if there's a new good that's better than the old ones, right? Like say you have a car, but now your city implements a really, really good public transportation system. Well, you might just ditch the car and use the public transportation system, right? And that transportation being 16% of your income might only go down to like 2% because buying a bus ticket every day is a lot cheaper than paying a car payment and car insurance and so on and so forth. So it just depends. And then unmeasured quality changes. So it's not just to like the whole shrinkflation deal, but like say a brand that you like gets bought out by another company and they don't make it the same, or they change their recipe, or if it's for clothing, they change the material that they use for their shirts. It just depends, and any number of things could end up impacting this because of that. Let's see here. Not worry about that. All right, GDP deflator is something that is important. I'm pretty much never going to use it, but chances are it'll be on the AP test. So essentially, it's just another way of comparing GDP from year to year. So it's calculated as the followed. So nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. And this is kind of mixing in both inflation and GDP then at the same time. So it's still kind of being compared from year to year because we're using real GDP. And you have to have more than 1 year in order for that to be calculated. For base years, again, base years, it's always going to end up being 100, just like with the CPI, because you're dividing the same number by the same number, giving you 1, multiplying it by 100, giving you 100. It's just when you start moving past that base year is when this ends up becoming relevant. So, Bureau of Labor Statistics, they do calculate some other indexes. We're not really going to worry too much about these, but they also do look at the firm side of things, right? The getting away from the household, see what operating costs for business is like, and not just worried about the consumers. And again, all of these things that we've talked about in this unit, whether it be GDP or unemployment or inflation, they're all measures of how an economy is doing. Again, they all have their problems, but they all have their upsides as well. Here's 2 measures of inflation that we'll look at just to compare them to see, because again, GDP deflator takes more into account than just the consumer price index. So like, it might be more drastic on the CPI because we're not taking like the overall economy into account, just those goods, whereas GDP deflator is. So it's a lot worse in some situations. It's a bit better in others. It just depends. So yeah, and we'll just check through this. Popular movies of all time and inflation adjusted. So some other fun stuff to look through as well is the changing cost of things over time and how much they would cost in today's dollars. But not something to worry about. And then, oh, here we go, interest rates. This is what I was looking for. So interest rates will be important for us. So interest, we'll talk about it all the time. It's going to be the payment for borrowed money, pretty much, right? So when you buy a house, especially, be an interest rate. When you buy a car, be an interest rate. When you take out loans for school, there's an interest rate, something like that. So again, it's the payment for money that you've borrowed. So the nominal interest rate is just going to be the interest number, and that's it. So for a mortgage, right? A mortgage is usually, it is for a house that you purchase, buy for your home. Nominal interest rate's just the number, right? So that might be something like 3.5%. Whereas real interest rate then is going to be taking inflation into account. Okay, so it's going to be the nominal then minus inflation, right? So healthy inflation is about 2%. It's about where we've been at, a little bit less. So if it's 3.5 minus 2, then the real inflation rate might only be 1.5% instead. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of this. So you borrowed $1,000 for a year, nominal interest rate's 15%. That's really high, by the way. you trust me, you don't want that kind of interest rate. And during the year, inflation rate was 10%, which probably a bad country to live in. So what we would do then is we take our real interest rate is going to equal the nominal interest rate with that I minus inflation with pi, which is 15 minus 10, giving us 5% for our real. So let's compare these two here then. Just over the years, and it can go negative, by the way, super uncommon, but usually, and that's another problem that we'll talk about later on in the course, once we much more heavily deal with interest rates. A lot of this unit's just defining the terms that we'll be using for the rest of the course. But usually some good deal of correlation between them. So that's it for this video. I realize it went pretty quick. I did skip over some things in this one just because the curriculum for AP Macro has changed over time, and in the coming years it's probably going to change a lot more because this whole situation has really tested what the academic side of economics actually means. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Again, I'm going to try to get you guys some more information on this somehow. Maybe some good research, get some of that in here. So anyways, hope this helped.